Recording. All right. G'day. Welcome to the Brisbane Infrastructure and DevOps user group. Slight name change. So obviously the logo will change when Amy can get some time to update that. But yeah, Infrastructure and DevOps. So yeah, welcome. Hope you guys stick around. Yeah, cool. Thank you everyone for joining us as well. That's really awesome. All right. Next slide. Nope. All right, where's my presenter view? Where's my presenter view? There it is. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're proudly sponsored by Hudson and Hudson Technology, Pablo at Hudson Technology. He's been really instrumental with providing us a meeting space and providing catering. Pablo's also been providing a lot of behind the scenes and advertising as well, which so huge shout out to Pablo for that. Also, we thank ScriptRunner for paying our Meetup because Meetup is not really free anymore. Yeah, so huge shout out to those guys and thank you so much for doing that. And finally, huge thank you for InSync for also sponsoring the event. All right, let's go and do the news. So it's actually a little bit more difficult to do the news when it's infrastructure DevOps, because obviously, doing PowerShell news, you can quickly just go and check out a few Reddits and check out a few blog posts. So it's going to be fairly light on certain things. That's just because of the fact that I haven't really fully gotten a whole bunch of sources for news. So the first thing is that obviously you guys seen this. I've been advertising it. So again, I'm going to just mention it. The PowerShell group has now been renamed to the Brisbane Infrastructure DevOps user group, or Briz Indo. I didn't want to put the UG on the end because that just meant then we'll be in Doug, which is just kind of a bit weird. So I think it's just Indos probably, and it's also nice and short. So just a big shout out for that. Now, one of the things with that is that while we are still going to be delivering PowerShell content, so people who can come here, they can still get that good PowerShell stuff. It just means we can broadcast up into a branch out into other areas. So you've seen that within the likes. The last talk where Jordan did a talk on Ansible, which was awesome. And we'll just be more focusing on infrastructure DevOps, that kind of side of things. So again, it's this means that we can do talks on Docker, Kubernetes, things like that. So we're not kind of just limiting ourselves to just PowerShell. The next thing is PowerShell. 7.1 preview 6 is out, so there's a whole bunch of fixes for that. You can go out and go check it out if you want to go have a look at the patch list. The next thing is for a little bit of DevOps news, which I just kind of found this quite amusing, is Docker is doing a big container image cleanup. So it's planning to delete 4.5 petabytes of container images that haven't been used for more than 6 months, 6 or more months. And the reason why is obviously they kind of worked it out. It's a lot. Like they're paying, I think it's like $320,000 a month. This is what the article roughly says. I think it's like $300,000 a month to host those containers. So yeah, definitely it's probably something. So if you guys are using Docker, you might want to touch it, and you got some containers up there that they're hosting. You might want to think about touching them. Alrighty, and the final piece of news is the PowerShell Conference Book Volume 3 is out in pre-release. It is on sale at the moment for $19.99 US, so that's a really good price. Currently at the moment we are having 15 chapters live. We've got 7 more on the way. I've been asked to write the afterword, so there's some really good chapters and really good authors in there. I may have had a read of Jordan's chapter. It was really good.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's really if you obviously want to support it, all the proceeds go to the DevOps organization for the on-ramp scholarships. And basically what that does is it just provides free training for people who are in disadvantaged or marginalized areas, and be able to actually skill them up in IT. So really good cause. So head over
Michael,
Yep.
Sorry, I was going to say, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I was just going to add some more news when you're done.
Yep. Okay. And then the final thing is you've got the big QR code there. So if you want to, yeah, you can go. That'll just take you to the Leanpub book. But yeah, it's on sale until August the 28th. So I believe that will be Friday for us because we're blessed with an extra day. Oh, sorry, that's Saturday for us. But honestly, just pick it up before on August the 28th, and you'll be fine. So, yeah, give it a go and go from there. So yeah. Any other news?
Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit of Azure news just because I'm working very heavily in Azure at the moment. So if anyone else is using Azure, there's some interesting stuff happening in the Australia East region, so New South Wales region of Azure. Availability zones are there now if anyone's interested in that. So you can get ZRS storage and higher availability on your virtual machines up to 99.99 for 2 virtual machines. They've increased the SLA on all the virtual machines from SSD up. So now, they're providing from standard SSD all the way up, they're providing higher SLA, which is awesome. Shared disks are also GA globally in Azure. So you can use shared disks. So you can do clustering with shared disks in Azure now. And Ultra disks are also now available in Australia East. So lots of decent changes there in Azure. So, yeah, make use of them. I'm going to immediately make use of availability zones because it allows you to increase your SLAs quite a bit. So, yeah, just thought I'd share those things.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add anything? All right. Okay, let's carry on. Alrighty. Microsoft Graph, the 101. So I was going to get a bit of a poll here. So this is going to be a real 101 for everyone. Who here has, let's just, with a bit of a show of hands, if I can figure out how to get the hand show thing going. Who here has a bit of an understanding of HTTP and REST? Yep. Jordan raised his hand. Wayne and went.
I actually don't know how to. I actually don't know how to raise my hand.
Oh, there's like a hand raise thing in Zoom.
Do you just do gestures or something, or
Yeah, I
like
think
that?
it's like a hand. Oh, that'll work. Yeah, just you do a gesture. So
Lift your hand up, fight
Should
against
be
gravity.
reactions on the toolbar.
Oh God, it's so hard.
all right. Let's take it one step further. Who here? Jordan immediately raises his head. Who here has a good understanding of OAuth?
Who thinks it's possible to have a good understanding of OAuth?
Yeah. Who here has a good understanding of OAuth? And I'm going to really focus on OAuth 2, not OAuth 1. So
stop. No one has a good understanding of that. Some of us have a working knowledge, and that's about it.
All right, and
I don't even think the developers of OAuth 2 know things about OAuth 2.
I think a lot of them don't know what they're talking about as well. Yes. All right. Let's ask the final question. Who here has a bit of an understanding of what a JSON web token is? All right.
There we go.
Yeah,
we have some takers.
Yeah, nice. All right. So what we're going to be doing today is we're essentially going to be doing a 101 from the HTTP. So we're going to be looking at basic HTTP. I'm not going to go into real in-depth stuff because ultimately we just really need to know the basics. From that, we're basically we're going to be looking at what JSON is. Everyone pretty much should have a bit of an understanding of what JSON is. Looking at what REST is, and then understanding what is OAuth. Within that, we'll be also looking at, within the OAuth, we'll be actually doing a bit of a deep dive into, I would say, introductory deep dive into JSON web tokens. It's quite fascinating stuff. So I've talked a little bit about it previously, but we're going to go a little bit further into it. Then finally, we're going to be talking about Microsoft Graph authentication. So basically, we're going to be going, okay, let's go and apply that to Microsoft Graph. We're going to be getting around Microsoft Graph. So we're going to use the Microsoft Graph Explorer to kind of explore what different API endpoints are available. Explore some resources that are available for people to kind of look around. And then finally, just have time for questions. Cool. All right. Apparently, I had that highlighted. Didn't know. All right, and okay. So what's not going to be covered during this talk is we're not going to be really talking about Postman, or we're not going to be doing a super deep dive into JSON web tokens. It's just going to be more of an introductory one. We're not going to be talking about Microsoft Graph webhooks or Microsoft Graph subscriptions. So that's really something that's going to be a bit for that's something for an additional talk. I don't think we're going to have enough time for that. All right, and it's going to go away. All right, so let's get started. So the first things first is, what is HTTP? So to really break this down, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but HTTP is a request response application protocol that's built on TCP UDP. Clients communicate with the server by issuing requests, and the server responds with responses. Client running an application, a browser, for instance, will use this to communicate with services across the internet. And the servers can be running web service, for example, PHP, IIS, Apache, Tomcat will service these requests, and data is transmitted using the body. That's pretty straightforward for what HTTP is. So I'm going to quickly do a bit of a breakdown of what HTTP is. I'm going to quickly move my thing off to the side so recording can see it. We're going to talk we're going to talk about the structure of a HTTP. So first thing we want to quickly talk about is the HTTP header. So the HTTP header really describes the characteristics of the request. So instructions, for example, I use an example on how to read a book. I'm just going to try and find a book because it always helps. I just want to actually had a book because I would work with it. I'll use Naomi's. So we've got Naomi's book here. So essentially, within the book, the HTTP headers will describe how to read the book itself. So, for instance, a good example is Naomi loves to hand me books that are in French. I can't speak French. I can't read French. So essentially, one of the requirements for her would be to go and find a book that has the language type English. Things that are included in the HTTP header are basic things like the response HTTP headers will contain the HTTP status codes. So, you know, your 404, your 403s, your 300s, your 200s. It contains, for example, the language type. So if you've got a client communicating with a server, the client can actually request a specific language type. Server might ignore it and hand it back in French anyway. So that usually is what happens with my daughter. With HTTP headers, they're always stored in key value pairs. So content type, JSON. Also application JSON. So the HTTP body contains the payload or the data that's being sent and received. So again, it's the actual content of the book. So with the book, you've got pages in the book. It's actually the content in the book. So the body can be encoded with different data types. So it's not specifically limited to, it's limited to anything. It's just a byte stream. So essentially you can send bytes for a file. You can basically send JSON, XML, YAML. It doesn't really matter. It's just basically a payload. The next thing you then have is the method. The method is used in the client request to describe the action. So a good example is get, post, put, and patch. I'm going to usually use these ones, and also forgot delete. Those methods within REST are really important because similarly to a PowerShell verb, it describes the intended action that you're wanting to do. So for example, if you wanted to get an Active Directory user, then you have a get. It'd be similar. It's similar with a HTTP method. So get retrieves a resource, pushes or creates a resource, put or patch updates a resource, and delete obviously removes a resource. You're not limited to these methods. Different servers you can write your own methods if you really want. It's not really recommended because it's always good to stick to some sort of form of standard. But essentially, you can do whatever you want there if you really wanted to. The two most common out there on the internet is get and post. So if you want to log into a URL, so if you wanted to log into Google, if you actually have a look at the trace, the network trace, that will be posts if you're going to log in. So things like that. And then finally, you have the URI. Now, I said the URI, not URL. The URI is the schema that describes how the HTTP endpoint should be accessed /URL. So a good example is, you can see down here, we've got, I'm just going to quickly bring out my big old laser pointer. You've got the scheme here. So the scheme basically describes the type of request. Is it a HTTP request, HTTPS request, FTP, SFTP? different requests can be used with a different scheme. Then you have the authority, and the authority is contains the user info, login information. So you don't really see this much anymore. So, but the schema is allows for this. So essentially, you can pass a username and password in clear text using the basic authentication, and then obviously after that, you can pass in the host. Note that the separator is an @ so obviously you have your host and then you have your corresponding port. Now that's obviously network port that the server is listening on, not your local port. Finally, after that, you have the path. So the path is similar to a location of this is the location of the service. So think of it as a file path. Different paths provide different services. So for example, if you go to google.com, you're going to get the search engine. If you go google.com/login, you might get a login prompt. So I don't think it's actually a /login, but it's just obviously a bit of an example. Finally, you have the query. Now note that it's prefixed with a question mark. Queries enable server-side filtering and selection improving selection improving the performance. So think of it as if you're wanting to search for a specific item within a page, rather than having to retrieve all the data, you can actually pass it a query, provided that the server can understand that query. Obviously, it's particular to the service that's been provided, and then pass that query as so. And then finally, you have your fragment. Now, I'm just going to quickly go to the next slide. So the key thing is obviously the question mark introduces the query, and then each item is separated with key equals value. Multiple key values are then separated by an and. So if you want to have multiple things, so for example, you've got tag equals networking and order equals newest, the and separates the two key values. One other key thing to mention here is that anything that is within the query or the fragment, if you're passing something that contains a URL known character, you need to escape it. So when you see the old %20s, those kinds of things, it's just immediately knowing that that's a URL escaped. So it can actually pass within the query string. The next thing you can see there is fragments. So fragments are similar to queries, except fragments basically allow you to refer to a resource that's subordinate of another. So a good example is here, you've got top. So I want to get the top resource of that. So essentially, that's pretty much it. Fragments are generally not really used within REST APIs, but they're still quite important to understand. The big one to remember is queries, because you can, within Graph, queries are available. So you can say, hey, I want you to search for this specific user with the UPN starting with blah. So that's, yeah. All right, HTTP status code. So we briefly talked about this. I like to simplify it down to a couple of things. 200s all good, 300s redirect me, 400s are client issues. Now within REST, it's really important to understand 401, 403, and 404. So 401 is forbidden. That means you're trying to access a resource that you don't have access to. 403 means you haven't authenticated to that resource. Now they can be used interchangeably. It depends on the service that's provided by the REST service. So some people might just say, no, that's a 403, everything's a 403. That's fair enough, but most of the time 403 is going to be used in situations where you have auth, but you don't have access to that area. 401 is you don't have access at all. And then finally you have 404. 404 means not found. So when you see 404, that can mean a few things. It can mean that the URL endpoint you're trying to access doesn't exist, but most of the time, in that situation, 404 usually means that when you're trying to find a resource. So for instance, if I'm trying to get a user called Joe Blow in my tenant, and it comes back with a 404, it means that the user doesn't exist. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that that specific thing that you're trying to do doesn't exist. And then 500, if you see 500s, then you have server issues. I think there was a quick message in chat. I've got a 4 times means that you, yep. All right. So I was going to quickly go through here with just a bit of a HTTP header. So I've got a bit of a screenshot here where if you have a look at essentially we've got some headers, we've got some response headers, and we've got some request headers. So I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but the key thing I want you to remember is that when we actually, the browser is connecting to a specific URL endpoint, so in this instance, we're looking at this URL in that path. You can see it's saying, hey, I'm Mozilla Firefox, and it's basically providing a whole bunch of different headers to the service to actually serve what it needs to process back. So when it responds back, it obviously has the content type saying, hey, this is how you rendered my page, and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces about the specific page. But essentially, you always are going to have headers on every request. The other key thing here is to note that you can see here we've got a status code of 200. 200's okay, fantastic. And then we've got some other bits and pieces in here. So that's pretty much it. That's a HTTP header. Remember, it describes the action. It describes how to read the book. All right, what is JSON? So just going to quickly poll everyone. What's JSON? Thumbs up if you know what JSON is. I think most people will have a bit of an idea what JSON is. So we'll keep pushing. So JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. JSON is basically just an encoding type. It's used within REST. It's used to encode content within the HTTP body of the request. So essentially, you would encode your request as a JSON and then pop it in your HTTP body and then send it on its way. JSON's really used in a way that just allows a representation of data in plain text. So it means, hey, I can read it as well as the computer can read it. It's not too difficult to read. Some people don't like JSON. Some people prefer YAML. Jordan loves XML. So really, yeah, it's just a way of presenting data. The key thing here to remember is that curly braces indicate an object, square braces indicate an array, and everything is separated with key, :value. So let's take a quick look. So you can see here, we have a bit of a JSON image. So you can see here we have an object called nothing, because it doesn't have anything. After that, we then have an array. So this is obviously denoted by the square bracket, and we have orders called orders. Within that, we then have some properties of that. We actually have an item within that array. So it's just an object, and within that object, we have some properties. So you can see here we've got order number, date, tracking number, custom ID, and then we have another array defined here. Now we only have one element within that, or one item within that array, but again, it's a separate object, and then we add that. Now the other key thing I actually forgot to mention is that you need commas at the end of each of your lines. So yeah, so that's pretty much JSON. It's kind of funny, a lot of people prefer YAML, a lot of other people prefer JSON. To be honest, I actually like JSON. The reason why is because I can follow along a little bit easier. I think Matt pretty much touched it in the chat there. It's column. What column do I put in this? And so, but at the end of the day, though, it's each to their own. I think it's just it's personal preference. And if you're really, really keen, you basically go and if you really want to be cool, you use XML. All right, so what is REST? I've talked about this a little bit before. So REST, I'm going to move the thingy around. So REST is basically called representational state transfer. It's essentially just a web service architecture that allows communication to an API using HTTP body and HTTP methods. So if you have let's say you have to access an endpoint, say / the service's users. Within that service, you would have different methods accepted. So for instance, if you want to create a user, you might send a HTTP method or post saying, hey, I want to create this user. If you want to delete a user, you can basically send a delete to that user. It's really straightforward. Essentially, endpoints are defined using the path, and obviously you can use query strings and things like that to query those services. If you've looked at function apps and things like that, a lot of them have REST front-end services. I've done a few talks on that. So realistically, REST is, wouldn't say REST is the best, but it's a really, really handy tool for really basic API integration. So, does anyone have any questions with regards to REST before we go any further?
I did appreciate your REST is the best pun, by the way. I just thought I'd appreciate that.
Thanks. All right, so let's have a bit of a look at a REST request. So I'll just quickly. Oh man, I actually don't think. Did I actually record this? I'm hoping I recorded this demo because I don't think I actually have the function app for this anymore. Let's try this one. Is it this one? Okay, cool. Yes, it is. So you can see here I've got Postman open, and I've got a simple localhost 7071. So I'm calling a local function app here. You guys can see that, right? You can see my screen? Can you guys see my screen? Okay, cool.
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. So you can, now that's popped out. Oh, no. I'm just going to do this. There we go. Cool. All right. So you can see here, I have a local function app running. It's just listening on localhost 7071, and I'm calling API/demo1. So the endpoint that we're accessing is demo1, and the path or the route to it is API. So, and you can see here, I'm just doing a real super basic REST call. I'm just doing literally a basic get, and we're going to hit send, and you can see here, I've got a formatted response here. So we've got a JSON response, which the server has sent a JSON response. And you can see here we have some objects. So we have an array, and then we have some objects within that array. It looks like we've got some titles of some music. So we've got Goodbye Moon Man, Rick Astley, the legend, and Cat's humans' most loved animal. So within here you can see, basically this is how we consume it. So if you're using an import, if you're using a specific programming language, let's say REST or Python or whatever, you would then just basically deserialize it. It was what we call deserialize. Essentially, you would convert that into an actual object within your language to work with. And that is pretty much it. So I'm going to keep going because I do think I have something else here. Actually, no, I don't. That's it. Perfect. So that's a really basic example of a REST request. So what is OAuth? Hang on, I've got to kind of move this thing around. Hopefully that's perfect. All right, cool. So what is OAuth? OAuth is an authentication framework that's used by APIs for authentication and security. OAuth provides limited access to a HTTP service based on authorization that's presented to the user when it's set up. OAuth exchanges the user account credentials with tokens that can be used for authentication. So essentially, this protects the user's credentials. Tokens have limited lifetimes. Couple of things with that. Unless there is no other way, you shouldn't be extending the lifetime of a token. That is really bad, really bad. To access API resources, the clients must specify what resources they wish to access. This is what we call scopes. So permissions, essentially what we call scopes. So let's have a quick look at what scopes are. I'm just going to quickly move this over so I can actually go through. So scopes are essentially used to limit applications, of what we mentioned earlier. So they're declared in the application process to define what resources the app has permitted to access. So, and this is also done by the client. The client's also required to declare what scopes they wish to access using a minimal approach. So for instance, let's say you have an API endpoint that you set up, and the scopes is user.read, user.write. Within your application that you're developing that you want to access, if you only need to use user.read, use user.read. Don't use user.write. The reason why is because you're basically trying to access something that you don't need, and you're expanding the permissions of what that application can do. So again, using least access privilege, yes. So scopes are denoted by an action.location. So you can see here action.location. So read.profile or user.read. It varies, but essentially you're having usually it's an action by location. And then all scopes must be defined within the authentication process to receive an access token. Within the access token itself, the scopes are encoded in the token. So variation of those scopes will cause the token to fail. So for instance, if I decide to grab, let's say I request an access token with user.read, and I re-encode that token with user.read and user.write, it won't work. Yeah, there you go. Principle of least privilege. So it really, this is one of the key things about scopes. Always use the least privilege. All right, so let's have a quick look, talk about JSON Web Tokens or JWTs. So essentially it's a way to be able to represent claims securely between two parties. It's in OAuth 2.0, it's used to validate the integrity of the access token. It's done by when the server or the issuer sends the token. Since it's issued it with the token with a private key, it can be validated by the server. The private key is not accessible publicly. I'm going to digress with 1 second into certificate-based authentication. If you were using certificate-based authentication, note that the private key of the certificate is what is used to actually encode the token. So you can literally, if you have your own certificate and using certificate-based auth, you can literally write your own JSON tokens for that. With that, that's just a word of you can do it, not recommended. If you can use, by the way, off the side, you can use certificate-based auth. It's perfectly fine, but just don't go write your own tokens. There's obviously a plain text and encrypted component. The plain text is predominantly used when the is used publicly, and the encrypted component is used for validation. So essentially, it's like signing a PowerShell script. You have an encrypted component and a non-encrypted component. When the script is validated, it basically validates against the encrypted component using the certificate. So it's that similar format. If the payload on the authenticity is incorrect, the server will basically validate the request, invalidate it and say, no, this is not correct. So it just really means it's that encrypted component allows you to validate the claim. All right, so let's have a bit of a breakdown of the JSON Web Tokens. So there's 3 key things within the JSON Web Token. You have the JOSI header, which essentially is just the JavaScript object signing. So this is really where it describes the crypto components employed. This consists of your key values, usually contains, the type of request. So, if we're going to have a look at a demo, you're going to see it say, hey, this is a JSON Web Token, the algorithm that's used, so what kind of cryptography algorithm that we're using here. It basically just describes how to read it. Other things that are in there is within Microsoft Graph is the nonce. So nonce basically prevents replay attacks. So that's a really important one to keep in mind is the nonce as well. Nonce can if you are trying to validate your own application with your own custom scopes with a Microsoft Graph endpoint, it won't work. That's because of the nonce, because it'll prevent the replay attack, which is perfect for that. The next thing is then you actually have the JWS payload or the JSON Web Signature payload. So that contains the attributes and the token claims. So the token claim would basically be the expiry date, the issuer, the audience, the scopes, the user, so the identity. There's a whole bunch of information within that. That's basically stored within the payload itself. And then finally, you have the signed encrypted version, which is, again, another JWS signature of the actual payload itself. So it just ensures that your claims haven't been tampered with. That's pretty much it. All right, I think you guys are getting a bit bored, so we're going to go and jump into a bit of a demo. So let's go have a look at a bit of a JSON Web Token demo. I've got another recording here, so we'll see if this works. So you can pretty much just go to jwt.io. This is a really great site to kind of validate your tokens and how validate your tokens. You can tell you what services are validated at, things like that. It's really quite good. So we're just going to paste in a token. So this is a token that I pulled ages ago from Microsoft Graph. You can see here one thing is that the different areas of the payload are separated by a dot. So this is the header. You then have the actual payload, and then below that you have the signature. So let's go and have a look. So you can see in here we have our type. So that's the type, and you can notice it's not a full TYPE. It's all abbreviated with the exception to nonce. You can see it's a typed JSON web token. We've got a nonce, which essentially is just preventing replay attacks from Microsoft Graph. We've got the algorithm, and you've got some other bits and pieces in here. Below that, you can see here we've got our audience, the issuer. So the issuer is obviously the service that issued the token. We then have, we can see the application name, the application ID. There's tons and tons of information within here. You can also see the scopes. So within here, I have user.read, profile, open email. I have a whole bunch of other things. So you can see the IP address. It's a good thing not on that IP address anymore. You can see the username, UPN, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty much that. And then down the bottom here, you can see you've got the blue part, obviously denoted, separated with a dot, and that's the signature of, that's the signature of this specific token. And that's pretty much it. Really easy way to go have a look at your tokens if you want to go and have a look. Now, one of the things as well, that's all encoded in base 64. So you can pretty much go ahead and you can just go and convert it from base 64 back into, I think it's Unicode basic. No, it's UTF-8 base 64. So you just convert it back into plain text. Okay, cool. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Alrighty, we'll just keep cracking on. All right, so the next thing is authenticating with Microsoft Graph's API. So let's go and have a look. So realistically, there's 3 ways of authentication. There's technically 4, but there's really just 3. The first one is the user flow. The second one's the admin flow, and the third one is certificate-based flow. Oh, sorry, a certificate-based authentication. Now, certificate-based, I'm going to talk about certificate-based first because I've talked about it briefly and I kind of want to reiterate on it. Certificate-based authentication basically is a certificate that you create, a self-signed certificate. It can be signed if you like, that you upload into that specific app that you're wanting to use with that authentication method. Once you do that, you can basically use a thumbprint. It'll obviously have your certificate thumbprint, and you can authenticate using that thumbprint. It will then go ahead and authenticate with that. You obviously need to have that certificate installed locally. Some of them might require you can just pass the certificate in if you choose to. That's perfectly fine. But most of the time, you can just, if you've got the certificate installed on your local machine, just pass the thumbprint in. It goes, hey, this is the thumbprint. Go get the certificate, and then create my tokens. Now, like I said, the certificate is your golden key to this application. So realistically, you need to guard that certificate with your life, because ultimately, if that certificate's compromised, you're either going to need to revoke that certificate real quick smart, because ultimately they can write their own JSON web tokens. And obviously there's no limited lifetimes or anything like that. So you pretty much, you could be in a bit of pain there if the certificates gets compromised. All right, let's quickly talk about the user flow and admin flow. So there's 2 types of flows there for 2 different things. The user flow is basically used for applications, so web applications, things like that, you know, your iPhones, your Androids, those kinds of things, where a user wants to interact with a web service within Microsoft Graph web service. So usually what would happen in those kinds of situations is you get that nice little prompt saying, hey, so-and-so wants to access your data. Do you want to allow this? Most people, the interesting thing with OAuth is that was the reason why it was implemented with OAuth 2, was to actually force people to actually acknowledge their what the application is giving access to. So it was a really, really handy way of to do that. The problem was that people just clicked next anyway, so they didn't really care, and they still, you know, people were still giving away information that they shouldn't have. So then you have essentially after that, a specific user flow, you're going to get what we call an authorization key. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the future. But that authorization code, that code is then used in conjunction with a whole bunch of, usually there's client ID, tenant, things like that, to exchange for a token. That authorization code is basically the code that is generated. Consenting is essentially a consent code that the application can use. The problem is that then you have services like Azure Function App, things like that are trying to access Microsoft Graph, or you have different things that are trying to do different services that are trying to access Microsoft Graph that don't really need to do this. So following that, you also have another reason why this is important is within the user flow. User flow has a token limit. So for instance, if you have let's say you have I'm just thinking out loud here, you connect to an application and you request a refresh token. That refresh token, there will be a certain number of refresh tokens before there will be no more refresh tokens available, forcing you to go back through this whole shenanigans of actually signing in and then authorizing access. So it's really designed to have a specific lifetime. Obviously, you can extend your token lifetimes and things like that to maximize it, but there's always a better way and there's a more secure way. The next one is admin flow. And admin flow is essentially what you do is you grant consent. The administrator of the organization will grant consent for the application to access specific areas of Microsoft Graph as that user account that it logged in as on behalf of. In that instance, you don't actually need to log in with you don't need to go through the whole rickroll of getting an authorization code. You just need to basically go and use the client secret in using the old OAuth 1 kind of approach to be able to actually connect to those services and then start using them. But the key thing first there is to actually grant access and delegate the access and then grant consent to those services. An admin physically has to do that. All right, so kind of briefly talked about it, but we're going to go on a bit more further. So let's quickly, I'm just going to go through my notes. Okay, cool. So we're going to go through the user flow. We're going to go through the 5 easy steps of doing that. So the first thing is the admin needs to log on and set up access to the application. So it's going to enable access, define the scopes, the permissions. It's going to the application will issue an application ID or a client ID. They're very used interchangeably, and a client secret. The next thing that it's going to set up is a callback URL. These are a list of approved URLs that your application will respond with the authorization code. So if you're using a local service, or sorry, like if you're using an application like if you've got an app like a PowerShell or something like that, essentially it would be you would just use the local host and you can actually capture the authorization code within the HTTP itself. But essentially what it's really designed for is you're going to have a web service. It'll respond back to that web service with a GET request saying, hey, this is my authorization code, and then the service will actually make the request for you. Now we've obviously set up our access. We can, the client, we're going to configure the, I actually missed something here. The next thing we actually need to do is set up scopes. We need to define our scopes and delegated permissions. So again, the admin needs to do that. Actually, no, I did talk about that, sorry. The next thing, once we've done that, is the client, we can now set up access. So the client is then configured to point to that application ID and tenant ID. You'll see those IDs when we go ahead and set it up, so you guys will know what I'm talking about. But they're quite important because the tenant ID is obviously your Azure tenant, and then the application ID is the ID of your application that you're trying to access. We can then go and get an authorization code. So the authorization code is used by the application to validate whether consent's been given. This application will respond to the callback URL, or to the specified callback URL. So when we're making the request, we'll actually put the callback URL in the request and it will respond with that. Now, if that URL is invalid in the sense that you put google.com and you haven't actually added google.com when you set up access initially, it won't work. One key thing about this as well, and this is a big red flag for everyone, it's case sensitive. It's character sensitive. So for instance, if you go, for instance, HTTPS localhost, and then you put in the actual URL, HTTPS localhost /, technically they're the same, but no, it won't, it will invalidate it. So the key thing to remember is that when you're defining scopes, when you're defining your callback URLs, it needs to be exact. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. All right, let's keep going. So the next thing is that we're going to then go to that URL and we're going to get that authorization code. It's responded. Great. We're now going to be able to exchange that authorization code with the client ID and the scope and the callback URL again with the code to exchange it for a token. So we need all those items again to be able to get for a token. Now, one of the key things you can do as well is there's a state. I'll briefly talk about that when we do the demo. States are essentially allowed to prevent any sort of spoofing or anything like that. And then finally, we can use our endpoint. Once we have our token, we can start calling our endpoints with our token. Now, when the token's expired, we can request a new token by exchanging the refresh token for a new access token. But the key thing here with Microsoft Graph is that if you're wanting a refresh token, you need to specify it in the scope. Refresh tokens just don't come off trees. They only are issued if they are allowed within the scope, and then with the client application is allowing it as well. So that's a key thing to remember. All right, let's talk about, well, actually, let's do a demo. So this is going to literally be a winged demo. I was thinking about recording it, but that's no fun. I know people like to see me stress when I'm not doing this, or when my demo stuff's up. So let's see how we go. All right, so first things first, I'm going to try and drag this to the right-hand side so I can see the screen. So we're doing our Azure portal. Just going to go to Azure Active Directory, and we're going to go to app registrations. So you can see here, I've got Indo demo. I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I don't really want that there. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to do step 1 and step 2. So we're going to go ahead and set up our access, and we're going to go ahead and, oops, I'm just going to go back one so I can keep my notes on my screen. All right, cool. So that's step 1. Let's go ahead and create an application. So we're going to go ahead under app registrations in default directory. So in your Azure Active Directory, I'm going to go ahead and create a new registration. We're just going to call this Indo demo. And you can see here we've got supported account types. So this really, again, remember, this is a client application that you're trying to use. So you can define who can actually access this application. You can have single tenant, multi-tenant, and personal Microsoft accounts, Skype, Xbox. There's a few things here. One of the key things to make note of here is that if you're using Microsoft Authentication Library, or if you're using Azure Directory Authentication Library, ADL or MSAL, you have to use multi-tenant. That's just a pre-requirement. I'm not sure what the new version is, but the current version is it requires to be multi-tenant. In this instance, we can make this single tenant. So what we're going to do here is we're going to specify our redirect URI. So what I'm going to do here is just go HTTPS, localhost, because I'm not running an actual web service, we're just going to be capturing the data and we're going to be doing this ad hoc. You can see here, it's a HTTPS endpoint. We always, when it's anything but a local host, I just do it out of habit. It needs to be a HTTPS endpoint. So let's go ahead and click register. I'm also going to crack open my notepad because we're going to capture some stuff. So the first thing you can see here is we've got the application or client ID. We need that. So we're going to go ahead and grab that. I'm just going to call this client ID. We're going to paste that there. Next thing we need to have is the tenant ID here. So you can see here, this is the ID of my tenant. So we're going to go ahead and copy that. And then finally, actually, no, that's it. That's all we need. So we only need really those two things. The next thing we need to do is we need to go and have a look at our authentication. So I'll quickly want to go through here. We're going to copy our redirect URI. And you can also specify a logout URL if you choose. The one thing I want to quickly talk about is implicit grant. So implicit grant is used again by Microsoft Authentication Library and Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. Don't really need to use it for anything but that, but basically it just allows you to get a token from the authorization endpoint. You don't need to tick this. unless you have those libraries and you're using them. That's pretty much it. We don't really need to go anywhere else. So you can obviously have the default client type, things like that. If you want to treat the public application as a public client, we don't really need to. We can just leave it as it is. The next thing is we've got certificates and secrets. For a user flow, we don't need to create a client secret. That's not needed, so we can go ahead and skip that. We don't need to create any sort of optional claims. We're just going to go ahead and jump straight into API permissions. So the first one you can see here is we have Microsoft Graph, and this is by default in every application. So to create add a permission, you can see here, I'm just going to quickly move this out of the way. Actually, I'm just leaving here. There's tons of different endpoints you can access. So in this instance, we're just going to click the big one first, which is Microsoft Graph. And you can see here you have delegated permissions and application permissions. So delegated permissions are user actual signed-in user permissions, where application permissions are used by background services. So if you're wanting to, this is where we'll talk about that in the future when we actually create when we do the admin flow. So let's go ahead and delegated permissions, and you can see here there are so many Microsoft's. There are so many scopes. Now, the key thing here, when you're actually wanting to work out an endpoint and what scope you need to access, Microsoft have really good documentation on this. Endpoint. I'm just going to see if I can grab one quickly, and I can show you how to. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it just kind of helps you articulate how to do this. So you can't just go tick things willy-nilly. If you want to be specific, go and consult the documentation. So I'm just going to quickly. Here we go. Okay, cool. So this is the documentation you can go to, Microsoft Graph documentation. You literally just Google it. This tells you pretty much how to access this URL or these endpoints. So the documentation is really good. Microsoft have done a really good job with this. So let's go ahead and we can list some users. So the first thing you can see here is the permissions. So within here, we can see the permissions type within a delegated, a personal account, or an application. So if it's a delegated, we need to give all these permissions to allow this specific URL, this specific REST endpoint to work correctly. If you don't, it's not going to work properly. For an application, this is what you need to do. So essentially, I'd go user.readbasic.all. So you can literally just go, in here, we can go and find user. You can see here you go user read basic all. So we'll go ahead and tick that. I'm just going to go tick one. The one key I quickly want to mention, the key one you want to add if you want to get a refresh token is offline access. So if you want to get offline access, you need to enable this. We're not needing that, so we're just going to go ahead and create our add our permissions. And you can see here that's it. So we now had our permissions set up, so we can now go ahead and get a authorization code. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in our browser here, and we're going to go and do that. So I'm just going to quickly go through here. Yep. All right, cool. So the key thing here is, I'm just going to actually end this show for a sec, so it makes it a bit easier. I can copy things. We're going to create that URL. So that URL is documented. So if we go to here, you can see this pretty much just will take you through the entire process of how to actually do it. Now, to get an authorization code, we need to hit the authorize endpoint. So this is a really good example. The line breaks are for legibility. It's a single URL string. So what we can do here is, I'm just going to have a pre-done one, so we can pretty much go ahead and do this. So let's go ahead and maximize this. And you can see here we've got HTTPS, login, Microsoft Online. We need to put in our tenant ID, so let's go ahead and do that. OAuth 2.0, authorize. So we're hitting that authorize endpoint with our tenant ID as the path. So this is our own tenant. We're going to then paste in our client ID. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we have the response type. Now this is going to be a code. So the code essentially is the authorization code. So then we have a redirect URI. So that's just a URL encoded of HTTPS localhost. It looks like HTTP actually, put HTTPS there. And then you have the response mode query, and then now the response mode, you can see in here, these are the parameters that are allowed and that are required and that are recommended. So the response mode, you can see, specifies the method that should be used to send the resulting token back to the app. It can be a query or form post. So we're just going to leave it as is. You don't necessarily need it, so because it's not recommended, you can remove it. There's a couple of other ones there, like state. State's used to ensure that there's no sort of cross-site scripting attacks and things like that. So if you're running in a production sense, you probably want to use the state parameter. And then finally, you can see here we've got the scope. Now, note that the scope here, we're only just using user.read. We're only just going to do a me get. So we're just going to get information about the user. We're not going to be able to go and list anything, but we're using our least access privilege. So let's go ahead and plug that in and see if this works. So let's see what happens. I need to sign into KeyPass to get a user account because I actually don't know my password. I think it's this one. Let's see if this works. Okay, first thing to note, we get our approval. So within here, we have to approve our what we want to access. So you can see here, it wants to read our profile and it wants to maintain the access to the data that it's been given access. So we can, this is a really, really annoying box. FYI, if you have, there's a, I can't remember where exactly it is, but there's a policy in Azure where you can remove that. And that's a really big one because a lot of people will just be like, yeah, I'm going to consent that. And then what that does is it gives the entire organization, it gives access to the entire organization. So if you've got a multi-tenant app, for instance, you've got an app that you're accessing like Zoom, for instance, you're basically just giving Zoom all the data. It knows all about your users. So it's really important to make sure that's not there. I can't remember where it is, but there's a setting within Azure where you can remove that.
Will that only appear if you're logging in as like an admin user already? Like,
no. So it appears for anyone who logs in for the first time. So in this instance, I know that like there are certain circumstances. Yes, it you can only like there's a policy where admins can only grant consent. But there is another, like, I know that there's a policy there somewhere. It's a big gotcha where basically people can just go, yep, consent, and then they will allow access to everyone. So
just sounds like a pretty big flaw in security if like someone can grant this application access to everybody else.
Yeah, it's one of our red flags when we do 365 health checks. I can't remember the exact details, but it's just a big gotcha. All right, so we can go ahead and accept. I hope this doesn't time out, and I pray that this is a demo. All right, so it looks like it's failed, but it hasn't. The reason why we know that is because we can actually see our code up the top here. So it's actually responded to the URL HTTPS localhost, and you can see up at the top here, we have a code. So that code, we're going to quickly copy and paste, and I need to work really quickly here before this times out. So I am trying to find, there it is. I'm just going to paste that in. So that's our authorization code. And let's now go ahead into Postman, and we're going to go and obtain a token. So I'm just going to put Postman there, and I have a pre-prepared one. So again, with obtaining a token, it's a different endpoint that we're accessing. You can see it's OAuth 2.0 token. You can see here we're putting our tenant ID in there. I think I've already got that in there. Yes. And then we've just got a whole bunch of different things. The key thing in this component, this part here, is the body. So within the body of a HTTP request, you can have different types of bodies, as what we talked about before. One of the types is the www form URL encoded. What this basically is it's substituted the query string into the body of the HTTP request. Now you can do it in the query string, but Microsoft, the documentation, I always follow the documentation, is you put it in the actual request itself. So what we can do here is let's go ahead and untick client secret because we're not sending a client secret. We're just going to quickly copy and paste these values in here. Oh, we don't need tenant ID, code, authorization code.
You're not a very efficient web service, by the way, Michael. You're a bit slow.
Oh, thanks.
You want to turn that around quick, man.
Oh, whoops. No. Whoops. Sorry. That was the wrong one. That. I then need to grab the scope, which I didn't grab. So we're just going to grab user.read, wherever that is. There it is. We can go ahead and grab that. So again, we need to put the scope in. So if we go and paste that in now. Now note what we're doing is we're sending a post. We're using the post HTTP method, and we're sending it to that endpoint. So now if we go ahead and send this, hopefully this works. All right, invalid. Request is malformed or invalid. What have I done wrong? Grant type authorization code. I'm just literally going to have a quick look at my documentation.
Is that grant type correct? That's probably what I would call out, but it might be correct.
It's authorization code, yeah.
Okay.
That's what the documentation says, yeah. HTTPS localhost. Yep, that's right. Redirect. User.read. Client ID. Okay, something's not right here. What's it going?
Where actually is your? Oh, it's the code. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Invalid requests. Post ID. Invalid grant. Invalid grant.
So code is actually meant to be code, not authorization.
It should be. Like, I've just gone through the docker and like, hang on, give me a sec. I need to move this up again because it might be. Yeah, you might be right. So you can scroll down here and you can see.
That's unlikely.
Grant type authorization code. Redirect URI. Yep, that's code. Yep. Scope user.read. Client ID. It might be because my code. I might have taken too long. I was going to try it again and see if this works. See if we can get it to work again. So I'll just grab that.
Fingers crossed.
All right, so we've got a new code. Oh, maybe I didn't pasted the entire session state at the end. Yeah, that's why. I put so the code has there was an additional value on the end of it. That's why it didn't work. So let's go ahead and just paste that back in, and then let's try to send this again. All right, request body must contain the following parameter: client assertion or client secret. I didn't think I need the client secret. Okay, I'm just going to pass. I didn't think I need the client assertion either. Why is it not playing ball now?
Well, it's saying one or the other, not both.
Yeah, it's saying one or the other. So request body must contain the following parameter: client assertion or client secret.
Oh, you can get a client secret, no problem.
Yeah, it's just you don't need a client secret for the authorization code. It's not required.
Okay.
Unless, I don't know, just because it's a public. Not because it's a public app. Let me just quickly change that. Let's see if that fixes it. This is why you always do your demos beforehand. All right.
So this is good. Sometimes the troubleshooting is actually really valuable.
So we can get another. Oops, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go back. I need to go and actually get a new authorization code. All right, let's try this one. Session state, copy that. I'm just going to paste it straight in here. Paste. Yep. Go down, send. it shouldn't need a client secret. Why does it want a client secret now? All right.
Would you need to mention the version number of the API, like 1.0?
It's 2.0. It's in the URL.
Of beta?
No, because we're still exchanging
Okay,
it
this
for
is
a
it.
token.
Yeah, okay. This is for the token. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just trying to get a token. Like, I don't think this is HTTPS localhost. I'm literally going to double check everything now. Like, usually it's
Yeah, I think you have the /. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a / there. It might be because it might want to be URL encoded, but I don't use like it. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Yeah, it shouldn't matter at all. All right, I'm just going to chuck a secret in there. So if you want to add a client secret, you can just go ahead to certificates and secrets and then create a new client secret. So let's just give it a never expiry. So I'm just going to go demo like so. And let's just go ahead and copy that to client secret. Now, the client secret is really more used for the admin consent, but in this instance, we're just going to just use it for this demo. So let's go ahead and paste it in. Let's go ahead. Okay, cool. All right, I don't know why I decided I want to do that, but now you can see we have an access token. The key thing here is we can actually go ahead and grab that token. So let's go ahead and do that, and we can actually go and have a look at it. So within here, wait, once it loads, my website internet's going to be a bit slow, especially if I'm sharing it. You can see here, we can paste our token and you can see all the info about the token. The key things here, you can see the app name, the user, you can see the scope as well. Where's the scope? Scope. There it is there. So you've got the scope, user read, profile, open, email. So it's only allowed user read. And that's pretty much it. So that's how we get a token, obtain a token using the user consent flow. Does anyone have any questions?
So that one there is all interactive.
Yep.
When you're doing this through like a non-interactive one, you have to use that certificate-based or the client secret. Isn't that right?
Exactly right. So you can use either certificate-based or client secret. So if you're using certificate-based, I actually am not going to demo certificate-based, but essentially upload a certificate. It's pretty straightforward. You just upload a certificate, and then realistically, the certificate then becomes a issuing certificate. So when the issuer actually provides that token, it's using that certificate to create that token. So essentially, you just create your own token.
And does Microsoft at least give you the scripts to generate those certificates? Because usually X509 can be very picky about the different types that you use and stuff like that.
So Microsoft have documentation on how to actually create the certificate and upload it. It's very picky. To be honest, it's not really used. The only time I'm going to really recommend using it is if you're using 365, the 365 PowerShell module, which has the new 365 PowerShell module version 2, which has certificate-based authentication available. So ever since Microsoft deprecated basic auth with their PowerShell 365 PowerShell management module, certificate-based authentication is the preferred method for services to be able to interact. Because the problem with it is that is MFA. So,
but if you're wanting to do something in a script without any hands-on stuff, you would have to. You can't use what you've done now, can you?
No, certificates bypass MFA.
Yeah, certificates bypass MFA. They don't.
And for non-interactive scripts, so things that run headless, on schedule, you need to have something that's not MFA.
Yep. So there's a section called somewhere in Microsoft Docs. I came across a section which is setting up service principal in Office 365.
Yep.
And they have some description about the same thing. What I found is they were missing a lot of information, but it would still give you an idea of, you can just use a certificate, and that if you use a certificate authentication, even with your regular Azure AD module. So let's say when you say connect to the tenant, there is an option to use a certificate thumbprint. So
Yes.
So that would be using certificate authentication, which bypasses MFA altogether.
So one thing about certificate authentication as well, this is one thing I kind of want to mention with 365, is that if you are using cert-based auth for 365, while you are defining your scopes locally here within your API permissions, you also need to actually grant a role within if you wanted to, for instance, manage Exchange, you're going to need to actually grant the application SPN a role as an Exchange administrator within the Azure portal itself, or it won't work. So it's a big gotcha. But it's something that I know that I've been caught out with, and I was trying to help a gentleman to get this working. But anyway, let's talk about admin flow and admin consent flow. So we're going to jump back into a bit of a, to be honest, I think I just want to demo it. I think we can, I think everyone's kind of gotten around the kind of the flow process, and we can just go through a bit of a demo. So let's talk about admin flows. So admin flows, we can set up access. It's a very similar process with the exception that the admin grants consent to the application. And then we don't actually need to, we can request a token using the client secret. And we don't need to go through we don't need to retrieve an authorization key. So let's go ahead and do that. So we've got Indo demo. We're going to go create a new one. So let's go and just go Indo demo 2. Again, we're just going to give it single tenant. I'm just going to send the same thing, HTTPS for ease of use. I'm going to go click register. So very similar process with the exception that we have to create a client secret. Interestingly, though, we have to create a client secret with the other one. I didn't think we need to. If something's not right with that, I think it might be implicit grant. I might have needed to turn that off. I can't remember. Anyway, so essentially here we can go ahead and make note of our client ID. I'm just going to use the existing tenant ID because it's always unchanging. So tenant ID will always remain the same. The redirect URI will remain the same. So the only other thing we need here is the client secret. Let's go ahead and get that. So again, let's go to certificates and secrets, new client secret. It's expiring in a year. And let's go ahead and copy it. Keep in mind, like I said, when you close this window, you lose access to that certificate. You cannot copy that certificate. That client secret again. Once we've completed that, we can now go and set our permissions. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to biff this. Let's get rid of this. We're going to remove that permission. We don't want that. So we're going to add a new permission. And what we're going to do is we're going to click Microsoft Graph and we're going to click on application permissions. Now within here, we have a whole bunch of different permissions. So we're just going to go to user and we're going to go user read all. Now note, you can only read all because ultimately this doesn't have an actual account. It is only able to actually read everything. So I'm just going to quickly read all. We're going to click add permissions. Now the one thing to note here is the status. So you can see here we got not granted for MZ default directory. So what we need to do now is we need to grant admin consent. So let's go ahead and do that. So once we've granted admin consent, we're saying, yep, we're happy with these permissions. I've just done it across the board. Usually what you would do is you go through and do that. You could also remove consent, and that will globally remove consent for things. So let's go ahead and actually now get approve access to this. We can't use the client secret yet. We actually still need to log in and approve this specific application. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to a different URL. And this URL uses the admin consent URL endpoint here. So you can see here, we've got a client ID, a redirect URI. It's way simpler than the authorization flow. The user flow, but still, it's much simpler. So let's
sorry, Michael, I actually thought they gave you the admin consent URLs in the portal now. I'm surprised that's not there.
I don't think they did, no.
No, I've actually seen it somewhere before in there. I don't know where it is, though. Who knows?
like to add it to a role?
No, like on that screen where you click the grant admin consent, I've actually seen the URLs come up where you can literally just go click, 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 and do what Michael's about to do manually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
Yep. So what we can do here now is we can go ahead and grant consent. So obviously we've got our tenant ID, admin consent, client ID, and we're going to put our redirect URI in. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and close this down. Firefox is going to clear a safe password. Let's go ahead and reopen it and log in. So again, we need to log in. I need to go and get my password.
Because as you can see, there's nothing secretive in that URL. Like, there's no reason why Microsoft couldn't just provide them. I've seen them there before.
Yeah, once we've done that, here's our consent page. So we can go ahead and say, if you accept, this app will grant access to the specified resources for all users in your organization. No one else will be prompted to review these permissions. Accepting these permissions means that your app is, you allow this app to use your data, specify the terms of service and privacy statement, blah, blah, blah. So let's go ahead and accept it. We don't need to worry about any sort of response. It'll respond back to localhost. But realistically, when it responds, what it's doing here is it's basically just responding back to your web server saying that consent has been given and that it's happy to actually proceed. So that is now using that now, we can actually go ahead and get another token. So let's go back to Postman. I wish they called it Postman Pap anyway. We're going to go ahead and change that, but we're going to use the same URL endpoint. So you can see here, same tenant ID, OAuth 2.0 token. So we've got a different URL. We're going to have a different client ID and a different secret. So we're going to go ahead and place that in. We're going to paste that client secret in. We've got the same local host. We don't need a code, so I'm just going to untick that. This is a great thing about Postman. You can just untick it and from the request, and then it's gone. And we need to change the grant type. Now, it's not an authorization code anymore. It's going to be client credentials. So let's go ahead and change that. Again, this info is all provided on the site. So if you can go here. I just remembered I closed it, so I'm just going to quickly paste. Oops. I'm going to paste this in, and you can see here. So grant access without a user. And you can see in here, it'll pretty much, it's taking us. I'm just taking you through this. Example usage channels. Not this one. It mustn't be this one. Oh no, because I'm in the wrong one. Grant access without a user. Register your app, configure to use graph. Yes, so get your consent, approve it, and then basically you should get a consent response, which we did, and then you can obtain your access token. And we're going to be using the grant type client credentials, and it must be client credentials. The application secret is also required. You can see the scope and the client ID and the tenant, and so all these items are required, which we have here. And we're going to go ahead and request our token. So let's see if this works. Okay, the provided request must include a scope input parameter. The provided value for the input parameter scope is not valid. The reason why is because user.read I didn't add to the scope. So if you guys remembered, and we go and have a look at the permissions, it's user.read.all. So if we put user.read.all, I'm just going to put all on the end. That should fix it. Okay, why is it not fixing it? It's not valid. It's valid. Why is it not valid?
It's not case sensitive or anything, Michael. I don't know.
It might be case sensitive. I can't. Oh, actually, no. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do something else. Another way you can do it is you can just go graph.microsoft.com. This is another way. So you can essentially just say use the inherited scope instead of actually specifying the scope. So we can actually just do like this. What's 2F? It's slash, isn't it? Pretty sure it's slash. I'm just going to see what happens here. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. I know that there's a default scope which you can use, and essentially that scope, it's essentially just an inheritance. There you go. So you can just use .default, and that's just basically the inherited scope that's provided by the application. So you're not specifying a custom scope, you're just using the inherited scope. And there's our token. So that's pretty,
much easier.
Yeah. So it's much easier. Yeah. So it's essentially you can go ahead and request a token every time. You don't necessarily need a refresh token because ultimately you can just go ahead and just request a token. And that is pretty much that as the demo. So I'm just going to quickly close this down and jump back into the portal. Back into the demo. So the key thing to remember though is that when we're using admin consent, ensure that the appropriate permissions are available. Ensure that the appropriate permissions that have been set is available. So like I said before, when we went to that documentation, if you're using a URL endpoint that doesn't, that has a whole bunch of different URL scopes that's required, make sure that those scopes are set, because if you don't, you will have issues accessing those endpoints. Alrighty. Any questions? I'm just gonna. Why does my?
I've got a question around the certificates and the admin consent.
Yep.
Why wouldn't you just use admin consent for the background processes?
It's just easy. It comes down to whoever. It really comes down to user taste. Ultimately, I prefer to stay within the OAuth confines because ultimately using tokens is a little bit more secure. I'm not going to say much more secure because ultimately you've already granted consent. So technically the client's secret is your password. It doesn't really provide much extra security compared to having a certificate on site. So I think the only thing it really does provide is if you have custom if you have custom scopes set up, oh, Jordan had, okay. I totally just saw the chat. Okay. So if you have custom scopes set up that basically are outside the application, so for example, you have user.read.all, user.read.write, and your application itself only needs user.read all, then that's perfectly fine. That would be an additional thing because ultimately you're leveraging the scopes permissions to as the least privilege. Certificate based basically means you can write whatever you want, realistically. But at the end of the day, though, personally, they're both the same the way I see it. And ultimately, you can just use the default. Like you can really just use default scopes that are defined.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know how we've got certificate-based flow, and then we've got, I think, was it certificate flow, and then there's admin flow, and then there's user flow. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, why would, if I was running a PowerShell script and I can simply just hit a URL to get an authorization, get an access token whenever I want one, using the admin consent flow, why would I go to the trouble of certificates?
Certificates realistically don't require even admin consent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't
No, I think no, they still do. Like once you grant the once you have selected the APIs, so they would still need the consent, and then only because the application is on behalf of user making calls to access the information, and that's where the consent thing comes up.
Okay. So
because I remember setting this up the exact same thing for a PowerShell script, and of course I wanted because the PowerShell script needed to run without the MFA.
Yeah.
So that's where I had to go through this process and grant the admin consent because I had selected. It was reading user all information, so read users.all. So definitely I had to do the same process.
Okay. Yeah, ultimately, I don't really see any difference between the two. So realistically, if you have an admin consent or if you have certificate-based, essentially they're non-MFA-based endpoints. Like they're non-MFA-based authentication providers. So personally, I just stick within the confines of OAuth because I think OAuth is just a better, I won't say a better way of doing it, but it just means that like they're like different authentication providers. Think of it as like certificate-based is Kerberos to, an OAuth as OAuth. Like, they're just, apples and oranges. I do find that within Exchange, however, certificate-based is the way that they're moving forward, especially within the new PowerShell modules. So essentially, certificate-based would be the preferred option until they would have admin consent. But realistically, not many people want to do admin consent when they can just have a certificate. So it's kind of like they're both the same but different. So let's quickly go on to the next part, which is just navigating Microsoft URL endpoints. So how many people here are familiar with Microsoft Graph Explorer? I think pretty much everyone will be pretty. Just raise your hand if you're familiar with Microsoft Graph Explorer. So with any REST API, g'day Gavin, I just saw you pop in too. Welcome. With any Microsoft Graph endpoint, let me rephrase that. With any good REST-based service provides a nice kind of exploratory tool that allows you to kind of get around things and play with things. Microsoft Graph have Microsoft Graph Explorer. It's fantastic. And it kind of really allows you to kind of just get in there and play around and see what's available. So you can just jump in there and go Microsoft Graph Explorer. Go to our faithful DuckDuckGo and just go ahead and have a look at it. So you can see in here, what you have is a really basic Postman window. It allows you to, run basic REST queries and things like that, and you can actually see responses. You don't necessarily have to sign in. It will mock data back to you. So you can go ahead and run a query, for instance, and we're getting some metadata back. The key thing to remember here, though, is Microsoft Graph have two versions of their API. They have version 1, and then they have version beta. When you're actually looking for content, I strongly recommend looking at version 1, seeing if it's available in there, and if it's not, taking a look in beta. There's a lot of stuff in there, and I mean, version 1 is insignificant compared to beta. Microsoft have been standardizing a lot of their content and a lot of their services, so that's all getting pushed into beta, and which will then eventually get pushed into the new version of the API. But it's definitely recommended having a bit of a look in there because you can see some interesting things in there. But as you can see here, most of the content that we can query, for instance, we can query Microsoft Graph Me, you can see if we call the beta, so this is the user, this was version 1's endpoint. So if we query beta and we go ahead and run it, you can see there's a lot more stuff there that's made available to you if you just want to query a username. And these are just things that are really made available on beta. They're really cranking up the API functionality. Other really important things with this is that you can sign into your account and query your own tenants data, which is really quite handy if you just want to have a bit of a play around. And they have a really handy side thing here with some sample queries. So if you want to, have a look at, for example, your Microsoft Teams and create a channel, that's obviously locked because I need to sign in and create a channel. To sign in, I can click on my Join Teams, and it'll basically run and provide some metadata. Obviously, if we want to create something, we can change the method. That can be done there as well. So, a lot of this, so if we go graph/users, it might be locked. Yeah, okay, it's locked. If I'm posting not allowed until I actually sign into my tenant. But it's a really, really handy thing for you to be able to quickly create something and work with it. The other thing you can see here is we've got some request headers, so you can create custom headers if you want to send them through, and then if you've got modify permissions, and then access tokens. Now, one of the things that I totally forgot that you guys didn't see is me actually querying Microsoft Graph within Postman. That was one thing that I didn't demo. I showed you guys how to get a token, but I didn't actually show you what is involved in actually querying it. So let's go ahead and do that. Call it Microsoft Graph. So you can see here, I'm just quickly fast forwarding. This is just a recorded demo. I'm just signing in, getting my access token, capturing that. I'm interested to see what I did have a client secret. Okay, you can see here, there's my access token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that token. Now, I'm just going to quickly pop that in and paste that there. And the reason why I'm pasting it here is just because it just helps me do this over and over again. So we're going to be querying this URL endpoint. So similar to what we did within the Graph Explorer, we're going to be using graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me. But the way that we actually query our tenant's content is we're basically going to specify a header. Within the header, we're going to use the authorization header. This is known. This is a standard header. And this header tells the URL what user or who we are. Realistically, it's an authorization, and it basically provides the identity of the user and its authorization of it. And remember, the access token contains the identity as well as the access, as well as when the token is to expire. So it contains all that information. And you can see here, all tokens within Microsoft Graph are prefixed with the bearer and then space. So it's telling Microsoft Graph that this is a bearer token or a token that has been exchanged. Access credentials that have been exchanged for a token, or what we call a bearer token. So you can see here, we're just going to do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and click send. And you can see the send a request, and that's it. That's how easy it is. So we've gone ahead and sent a request, and you can see here some data back. You note that I'm querying the version 1.0. So if I was to query the beta URL endpoint, that will return a ton more information back. But because we're just querying just the version 1, we get some limited data. And that's pretty much it. That's how we query Microsoft Graph. And so if you're using PowerShell or something like that, that would literally just be an invoke REST method. Within the header, you would basically specify the authorization, and then in the value for the authorization, you would specify bearer, put the token in, hit that URL endpoint, and then Bob's your uncle, you then have data. If you're using curl, it's very similar. The thing is that all you need to do is put the token in the header with the put the token in the authorization header with the bearer prefix, and that's it. So does anyone have any questions with regards to that?
Yeah, I did have one of the question is, how do we handle paging? I think, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so a couple of ways you can handle paging. Microsoft, it really depends on how Microsoft distribute the content. Within PowerShell, PowerShell has that auto paging feature within PowerShell 7, fantastic. Traditionally speaking, within the response of a URL, so if you're querying, let's say, 10,000 users, it will basically have within the body of the response is more data, has more data, something along those lines, and it will provide an additional URI within that.
Which would, okay.
To be able to actually query to go and recursively pull those values. So when you're working with APIs, especially with Microsoft, it's really important to pay attention to that. One of the things you actually just touched on briefly, I want to say briefly, but it kind of segues a little bit into it, is batching. So Microsoft Graph does support batching. Excuse me. And what batching does is essentially you can send a URL request to that URL endpoint. And within there, you basically say, these are the URL requests I want to run. So you could say, all right, I want to do, graph.microsoft.com version 1 users. I want to run, and you can see here, if we run this, we should get a list of users. There you go. I want to run all this other stuff. And you can actually essentially, stage your request. So essentially, rather than doing multiple requests, which do have lifetimes, there is an API limit. You can essentially put that within the batch. I think it can take up to 10 items per batch request. You can batch those items up. And that's a way easier way to manage your code, because it means that you're obviously using less API requests. So definitely recommend checking out batching, but I'm not going to really demo that because this is more of an introduction to Microsoft Graph.
Yeah, that was my other question, was how to handle throttling, because I was hitting, I was getting errors with 431 throttling errors related to 431 and all.
So with throttling, it really comes down to batching, so making your requests smarter. So essentially, what I found was with any sort of API limitations, it's a two-edged sword. You have to kind of make the best that you can with an API request and response, also with the API endpoints, because remember, each request counts to it. So what you would do in those instances, I would batch first, because you're basically optimizing the API request itself. The second thing is then in the code, you would need to factor that in. So you'd be looking for those specific errors and then writing an exponential back-off timer. Some of the times within the response header, it will tell you, I'm pretty sure it does with Graph, it will tell you when you can query again, how many seconds you need to wait. So essentially what you can do is, the problem in PowerShell with invoke REST method is you can't query the response header, so it gets a little painful. So you'd have to use invoke web request, and then you could query the response header. Within the response header, you would then have the actual back-off timer, and using that, you would then just do a start sleep, wait for that period of time. Ultimately, you could just guess, and then you could, as a secondary option, you could just guess and say, hey, do a wait, a do while, exponential try, try again. If it's failed, then wait another 10 seconds. So write an exponential back off. So, like the first one might sleep for us 2 seconds. The second one might sleep for, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. You can go and get 16, 32, 64, 128. So you can just write an exponential back off to kind of cater for that. I've hit that as well, but it's, and what I've done is that's kind of the way I've gotten around it. Most of the time it's 5 minutes. So, unless you're really smashing the API, and then again, optimize the code to use batching instead of writing an individual request.
I certainly would look into the batching, because the only way I was able to work around that was I use more filters, which would bring less results. So that would reduce the cost of the query. So
that's another way. But essentially, you need to optimize your code to be as good as it possibly can. But most of the time, especially with REST is one of the Achilles heel with REST is the fact that it's very intensive when it comes to actually making requests. So when you have GraphQL and things like that, where there's it's a GPT. I can't remember. I think it's GPT. Essentially, it's more of a combination between REST and SOAP, which basically is more you describe in the schema what you want, and it gets it for you. So you don't have to make multiple requests and say, I need to get this request and join this and do this. You basically say, this is the data I want, and the service actually does that for you and then returns it. So it's a more optimized way of doing things. I think it's, But anyway, that's, so let's quickly talk about some handy dandy links. We'll head over to some handy dandy links. So first one's developer.microsoft.com. You can pretty much go there to all your good stuff if you want to go and have a look at different things. I'm just going to quickly minimize. I'm just going to end this and then just drag this over. So within here, if we go developer.microsoft.com, it's a really, really good endpoint. You can go obviously have a look at Graph, and there's tons of good stuff with Graph and Visual Studio and .NET. Other ones is Postman. So if you want to really have a good muck around, Postman's really good for it. If you don't want to mess around in PowerShell or curl or within Python, this is a really good tool that kind of just allows you to muck around with it. And one of the really good features with Postman is that you can actually save your queries. So you can kind of replay them. So essentially I did this talk previously. I pretty much have everything saved out and then just kind of copied and pasted it in. And it's really easy to use. So once you kind of get your head around all the bits and pieces, it's as straightforward as what you're going to expect. So Postman, definitely check out Postman. It's a really, really handy tool for just testing your API endpoints. The next one is the overview of Microsoft Graph. So let's quickly have a quick look. Yep, see you, Matt. Thank you for coming. So again, this is just your API reference. So this is version 1.0, but this is really where you need to go to actually go and have a look at the documentation of what's required. So let's go for a quick dive. Let's go on calendar, events, and let's have a look at the documentation to create an event. So you can see here, basically talks about how to do that. What's going on here. Talks about the permissions always really important. So this is the scope that you need to declare when you set up the app to be able to actually do this. You can see the HTTP requests. So you can see here we got users. We can use the object ID of the user. We can just use the UPN, which I think is really awesome. And then basically /events. You can see here, these are the required the headers. So you can see here we need the authorization header. I'm going to tell you right now, guys, the authorization header is required for everything. So that's mandatory. And you can see here the value bearer token. So bearer is the prefix token. The content type is application JSON. That's required. So the body of the request that we're sending will be a JSON type. So you can see in the request body, supply a JSON representation of the event object. Okay, so how do we do that? So we can actually just go ahead and click that. Somehow wait for this to kind of do that. And you can see here tons of information about it, the properties that are required. If you keep going down, you can actually see a JSON representation. Usually I just scroll right down the JSON representation and find what I need and then add and remove it because the object structure is being created for you. Once you've done that, it'll then send you either a 201 or whatever, and you can see there you go, here's an example. And this is the thing I love about it. You can see here's HTTP. This is a straight JSON HTTP, so this is what you'd be messing around with in Postman. You basically go ahead and copy this. Copy this body here, the JSON body here. Go ahead, and then within the body of the request, you just go ahead and say, all right, let's just say raw for some, and then we'll give it a JSON. We just go ahead and paste there, and then that's that. So that's for static HTTP. You can use C#. So obviously there has a specific library for it. So you can just go, so it's really easy to use. I strongly recommend you go check it out. And you can see here as well, if I want to go to beta, we can just click beta and we can see here all the similar things what we can do. Obviously it's quite similar. And yeah, so again, it's really, really, really easy. And you can see here, for JavaScript, as simple as you're going to get, create an object. I'll wait for the client, call the endpoint, pass it through. That's pretty it. That's pretty straightforward. It's really, really easy. The next one is if you're using things like, actually, we'll talk about the auth concepts first. Let's load. Okay. So the other thing is that the documentation that I was talking about earlier, the authentication concepts, realistically, yeah, you can just go here, MSGraph.auth. It literally takes you through all this, all what's required to set up your app. Basically what we did tonight, be able to cover it all. It really goes in a lot more depth than what I talked about, but it's a really, really, it's a great way to kind of go through and get a bit of an understanding of how everything works. One of the things I love about the internet and open source stuff is that there's tons and tons of people that are always willing to make your life easier. So you have Microsoft Authentication Library for .NET and Microsoft Authentication Library for JavaScript. So for all the people actually using .NET to authenticate the graph, you don't have to go through all that shenanigans. It gets quite difficult, especially if you're from a PowerShell perspective or a Python perspective when you're doing a user flow, because ultimately you have to pop up a user prompt, navigate to that URL endpoint, log in, and then capture the response back, and then pass that so you can get your authorization code. So you need to be able to write that logic into your code, or you can just use some already prepared libraries that do it for you that are done by Microsoft. So ultimately, this is a library for JavaScript. So this is using Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL. This is what I used for my authentication with my PowerShell / C# durable function app portal. So when I was authenticating with Microsoft Graph, it was all done through JavaScript. And all I have to do with here was essentially create an object saying MSAL, set my client ID, set a few bits and pieces, and then basically it managed the pop-up, it managed the token, it manages everything. So when I actually want to issue an API request, I literally just say request token method, and then call the then method and pass it into my REST function, and that was it. So it's super easy to manage. You don't need to manage refresh tokens, API limits. It does it all for you. It's great. I love it. So definitely recommend checking out if you're going to be using C# and things like that. Don't do it hard. Don't do it the hard way. That just sounded really bad, but don't do it the hard way. And you can obviously use libraries like C# and JavaScript and things like that. So I'm going to quickly open it up for questions and say thank you. So obviously, I see a hand from Rana.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you have used this library with PowerShell. Is that right?
No. So PowerShell doesn't really support. Okay, you could use the .NET library underneath, but I used it with JavaScript. So when I wrote my actually, I might be able to go dig it up. Give me 2 secs. It's 8 o'clock, so I'm just going to be a little cautious of time.
Oh, it is 8 o'clock, yeah.
And one more thing which I would like to add for everyone over here is that in case if you want to try all of these things and if you do not have a tenant, you can sign up for a free developers tenant, and that would keep rolling up. So I've been using my developers tenant since a year. You get 25 licenses. I think it's E5 licenses, free of charge. And as long as you're working with the tenant, you can keep using it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good.
So I'll paste the link in the chat.
I have a question while you're looking for that, Michael, and maybe Rana, you might be able to answer it as well. Does Graph allow you to access Azure or only?
Okay, no. Yes and no. That's really the answer. So there's some things that are available, but there's mostly they're not. So you really have to be calling the separate Azure API with that.
Okay. So you wouldn't use it to you'd use it to access Azure Active Directory and Office 365, but not necessarily like something in the back end of Azure like a storage account or Cosmos or something like that. Is that right?
No, I think you can. So whatever is available, the Graph would still have the API for it. Because if you see when you log in, I think there is a section for Azure, which covers a lot of things.
That's an Azure API. That's not the Graph API. That's a separate API.
Yes. So Azure API. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So you still have to go through the Azure Management API to get access to Azure. You can't use Graph for that.
Yeah. One really cool thing. This is just a bit of a FYI, Wayne. If you actually go into Graph, I'm actually just going to show you a quick little secret what I did. What you can do is, let's say we want to have a look at app registrations again. So let's go ahead and refresh this page. Essentially what I did is I looked at all the XHR requests. I'm just going to kind of pull this down to the bottom here. You can pretty much reverse engineer what API endpoint it's accessing to pull the data from the actual request itself. The Azure portal is accessing an API to build its content out. So I can't remember. There's so much content. The other thing you need to do is stop, this cleared. Whoops.
That's good.
But essentially, okay, let's click devices, and then you can see here, we have 200 text JavaScript, and you can essentially, here you go.
It does give there you go.
Yeah. So you can actually look at the what endpoints it's accessing. You can see, and it's quite interesting because some of it is Graph, 100%. Some of it's Graph. I've seen a lot of Graph requests. Others as calling a management API, which is not really published on Azure. So if you want to reverse engineer Azure, that's the way to do it. That's the way I did it anyway, because I got
good to know.
Yeah. All right. I'll quickly poke through the JavaScript for the auth for the code. So you can see here, just create an object. Within the object, you just give it a client ID. So that was the client ID of my application. Also defined what type of cache I wanted to provide. So here I just said local storage. So it's just I'm just gonna enable local storage so it can share across tabs. And then essentially I create an endpoint. So this is the function endpoint and the method. This is just a custom object that I create so that I can pass in and to request my portal's configuration data to build out the IT self-service portal. then you can see here I've got my APIs. You can see I've got the API automation task client. I've got read. And then here, once the document's loaded, create my object, pass that configuration in here, register my callback. So essentially I just need to register a callback function, which I've just got there. And then I just have the rest of its functions. So acquire token initialize, which is just acquires a token and calls my initialize URL endpoint. And then finally, once those functions are added, then it calls login pop-up, passes the request object, which is the where's the request object? It's the scopes. So it passes the scopes in, pops up, says, hey, you want to have, please log into 365, blah, 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 gets the authorization code, good to go. And then from that, I can then acquire my token and then initialize. And then I'm just passing that response back, which the response will be the authorization code. And then from that, when we call acquire token initialize, which is here, so it just passes it through. I'm just trying to remember what it's doing here. Yeah, it just goes and acquires the token, and that's it. That's pretty. It's super straightforward. So, I think something's not right there, but I think from Microsoft Authentication Library, it's super easy to use. You don't need to manage the tokens or anything like that. Yeah, I found it as a really, really useful thing. Now, one of the other things I quickly want to talk, even though we're a formal PowerShell user group, we might as well quickly touch on it. Microsoft Graph already have a PowerShell module, so a lot of the stuff is already available within the gallery, I think, as PowerShell module. Not Adam's PowerShell module. So if you want to use PowerShell module,
I think it's in the beta gallery, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I can't. Honestly, I can't remember. But essentially, you got the PowerShell Graph, Microsoft PowerShell Graph module. It pretty much does a lot of the stuff already. I find it funny it's using auto-rest. But essentially, it'll do, if you're using PowerShell, this is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So remember, this is not an actual, you wouldn't really want to do this in PowerShell directly. You can probably use the module, that'll do it all for you. But the thing with the module is that there's going to be missing URL endpoints. So you'll be waiting on developers to add that functionality versus just being able to actually go and query the URL endpoint directly. So that's pretty much it. I don't think there's really much else to add. Does anyone have any other comments or anything?
Now, when I used the Graph API module in PowerShell, I quickly found that it wasn't well built, and I'm better off just doing it myself.
Yeah, that's what I found as well.
Yeah. I think the thing is that a lot of those kinds of features, I think they're just kind of slowly adding those features on. They're kind of making it a little bit more easy to use. But the key thing is that if you are going to go down the lines of writing it yourself, the key thing is if for example, if you're using a user-based authentication flow, is you need to capture and create an actual login box. So whether that's a XAML, whether that's Internet Explorer, I think C# already have one somewhere. You can honestly, you could just go ahead and reverse engineer someone else's and work out how they're doing it. I know that the 365 DSC module relies on a C# DLL, which you can just go ahead and call. So essentially just go ahead and call that method and then you're pretty much good to go. So there's plenty of ways of going about doing it, but you need to do that. If you're using the admin flow, don't need to do it. You can just go ahead, issue an invoke request to that specific URL endpoint to go get your URL to get your token, and then from that start going for it. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. There's not really much else to add. Thanks guys for joining. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to stop recording now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks Michael, that was a great talk.
Yeah, absolutely, wonderful talk. And this is not recorded, right?